Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to my channel where I reveal the spiritual in everything. Subscribe because I upload new content every single day either here on YouTube or on my Patreon account where you can support me for £5 or more a month, for which you will receive all kinds of bonus content week after week. Thank you very much to those of you that support me on Patreon already because you're helping to make this kind of daily content possible. Now I'm running extremely late today, it's been such a busy day. It is now 20 past 6, meaning I've got 40 minutes to record this video and get it online if I want to keep to my schedule. Today I'm speaking about this well-known phenomenon whereby both children and animals seem to be able to perceive things that most adults simply cannot. You may have heard stories about children making statements that suggest that they have some kind of insight on subjects that they really shouldn't have any insight on at all. And those subjects can range from dead relatives to heaven to God. Sometimes children will say things that suggest that they remember some kind of previous life. Maybe you've had such an experience with a child directly. On a similar note, if you've ever had a pet, especially a very active pet, like a cat or a dog, you will have noticed that they often seem to be responding to things in their environment, things that don't seem to be there from your perspective. I want to explain that in this video, and it can be summed up in two words: innocence perceives. And so in order to explain what's going on here, I need to explain the meaning of innocence as I've done many times before. Because many souls talk about innocence, the word is thrown around a lot, but very few understand what it actually means. When a soul is born into human form, that human form does not yet have the cognitive capacity to critically analyze the world about it, or even itself. A newborn soul in human form, it cannot contemplate its own existence, or its own existence in relation to the world around it. It is simply responding to the phenomenon that it is exposed to quite naturally. It doesn't even have the cognitive capacity to understand the concept of its own name. When a baby hears its name, it doesn't understand that it's a name. It doesn't understand that it's a way of identifying it among others. All it's receiving is a series of sounds. But as the cognitive capacity of that child develops, it will begin to recognize that that series of sounds is indeed a way to identify it among others. It will recognize it as a name, and that name will be the foundation of what we call an egoic identity. An egoic identity is simply the way in which we understand ourselves, and it is accumulated through conditioning. So as that soul's mortal form continues to physically develop, as its cognitive capacity increases, it will be able to receive more conditioning, and that conditioning has the effect of building up the egoic identity. In other words, making the way they understand themselves ever more complicated. So in time, not only will it recognize its name, which again is the foundation for the rest of the egoic identity, it will recognize that it has an ever-increasing age value. It will recognize itself as either male or female. It will recognize that it has a certain sexual orientation. It will recognize that it likes this food, that it hates this music, and so on and so forth, until you have an enormously complicated egoic identity that has been brought about through the process of conditioning in the material realm. And I must emphasize again, the name is at the bottom of all of this, because all of that conditioning, that whole egoic identity, it was built up upon the name. So to evoke the name is to evoke the whole of the egoic identity. Now, the more that a soul becomes enamored with that egoic identity, with its own idea of itself and its place in the world, the more that innocence is lost. And the goal of the spiritual journey is to return to the innocence prior to the development of an egoic identity. This is why, as I've pointed out many times before, Jesus said to his disciples, "Unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." There's a reason that Jesus esteemed children so much, especially within the synoptic gospels. The idea is that we on the spiritual path, we return to the innocence of childhood, albeit with our cognitive capacities fully developed. That's what innocence means. It refers to that period before our conditioning. Now, the important thing as far as the subject of this video goes is, as far as the subject of this video is concerned, is that conditioning has the effect of blinding us to certain realities. When children talk about remembering heaven, for example, they are talking about that because as newly incarnated souls, they do remember the heavenly realm they were just in. But through the process of conditioning, they simply forget that. It's like I've always said, so often the spiritual journey is not so much an experience of learning new things. Actually, it's more comparable to remembering things that you had forgotten. In fact, the ancient Gnostics would often characterize the spiritual journey as a process of remembering, because in truth it is. And so it's this process of conditioning that causes us to lose that connection to the spiritual, that insight on the spiritual that all innocent souls, in this case young human beings, quite naturally have. And the same is true of animals. The only distinction between young humans and animals is that animals will never develop the cognitive capacity to have an egoic identity, and therefore animals will never lose that innocence. Therefore, they will never lose this insight on the spiritual, and more specifically in their case, they will never lose the ability to perceive the spiritual, what I call the ethereal rather, in the environment about them. That's why they so often react to things that from your perspective aren't there. They're simply seeing things that you are incapable of seeing. Now, I so often speak from the Christian tradition in so many different ways, and that's because it's the tradition that I'm most familiar with, and it's because it's the tradition that most people watching my videos will be familiar with, so it seems like the sensible thing to do. But in so many cases, there are parallels in all of the major traditions of the world. And I'll give you one example in this video because it's an example that I raised in one of my more recent entries in my commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. And it's an example that relates to Islam because Muslims will call figures like Jesus and Moses Muslims. They will say Jesus was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, Abraham was a Muslim, and so on and so forth. And this can confuse many souls because they think to themselves, hold on a minute, Jesus and Moses and Abraham, they lived centuries before the rise of Islam, so how can you possibly suggest that they were Muslims? And the reason is this. To be a Muslim is quite distinct from the religion of Islam itself, because Muslim just means one that submits his will to God. It's quite distinct from the religion of Islam that arose centuries after these souls existed in human form. And so because the meaning of Muslim is simply one that submits his will to Allah, to God, that means that by definition the likes of Jesus, Moses and Abraham were Muslims because they submitted their will to God. And this question of what it means to be a Muslim to Muslims or within Islam is highly important to this question of innocence, because in actual fact children are regarded as being Muslims as well, and it's precisely because of this stage of innocence, because Islam recognizes that during this stage of innocence children have a profound connection with God, even though they don't have the cognitive capacity to articulate it to anyone or even the verbal ability to. But that's why within Islam even children are considered Muslims. Again, Muslims being those who submit their will to God, because during that stage of innocence they are recognized as having still a profound connection with the divine. So even though I'm usually referring to the Christian tradition, and I'm quoting Jesus say things like, "Unless you turn or become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." I could make an entire series of videos just going through the way that innocence is understood in many different traditions around the world. The important point is that while each tradition might have a little variation on the way they understand the specifics of this phenomenon, it is universally recognized that children and animals, they do have that innate connection with the spiritual. They are able to perceive things that adults cannot. They do have that connection with the divine. And the reason is because of innocence. Because innocence fundamentally is the state prior to the oncoming of conditioning. It's the state prior to us developing an egoic identity. And most importantly, it's the state prior to us being immersed in that egoic identity. The ideal on the spiritual path is, as I said, to return to that state of innocence, but naturally with our adult cognitive capacity and with the egoic identity that we have developed for ourselves throughout the course of our life. It's just that now, having walked the mystic path, we are no longer blinded by that egoic identity. We accept it in what I like to describe as a tongue-in-cheek fashion. It's there, but we don't take it too seriously because we understand it for what it is. The goal of the mystic path is to return us to the innocence of childhood, but with our adult cognitive capacities and with a greater understanding of the proper place of the ego intact. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. Like the video, leave a comment, and I will see you tomorrow.